Andrew Harper sat at his desk, buried under a chaotic pile of notes, textbooks, and scribbled drafts. The dim glow from his desk lamp cast long shadows over the mess. 2 empty coffee mugs sat next to his laptop, its screen flickering from the strain of too many open tabs. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, trying to untangle his thoughts. It was his second semester in the engineering program. The classes were tough, but Andrew had always managed to keep up, until now. His last thermodynamics exam had been a complete disaster. It was his first major failure, and now he had to retake it with Professor Elliot Hunter. Hunter was a legend on campus, and not in a good way. Even the upperclassmen feared him. In lectures, he would fire off curveball questions designed to corner anyone unprepared. His predator-like smirk was enough to send chills down your spine. Rumor had it, he enjoyed pushing students to their limits to test how much they truly knew. Andrew shivered, recalling how Hunter had given Laura, one of his classmates, a 0 on her test for a single mistake in a formula. He slammed his textbook shut and covered his eyes with his hand. 2 days without sleep were taking their toll. His head was pounding, and his thoughts were a jumbled mess. "Damn it. I can't keep doing this," he muttered under his breath. "I need some fresh air. Maybe that'll clear my head." Getting up, he felt every muscle protest. His arms ached as though he'd been lifting weights, and a strange unease sat heavily in his chest. He wandered into the kitchen, instinctively flipping on the kettle and grabbing a block of cheese from the fridge. While the water heated, he made himself a couple of sandwiches. Once the tea was ready, he poured it into an old university mug he'd gotten as a gift during his first semester. Sitting at the kitchen table, Andrew tried to relax, but the headache only grew worse. Just perfect, he thought bitterly, rubbing his temples. Outside the window, the evening sky was a swirl of crimson and orange, the fading sunlight painting the clouds in lazy streaks. There was nothing unusual about the scene, but somehow it unsettled him. After finishing his tea, Andrew felt a little steadier. He checked the time, 6 p.m. Maybe a walk will help, he decided. Throwing on a worn denim jacket and pulling a baseball cap low over his brow, he grabbed his laptop, thinking he could review his notes in the park. Packing up quickly, he headed out the door, hoping the crisp evening air might bring some clarity. The evening chill wrapped itself around the city, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and fresh leaves. Autumn was staking its claim. Andrew walked past rows of houses, their windows glowing softly as the first lights came on. Now and then, his attention was caught by the sound of laughter or snippets of conversation drifting through open windows, but he kept moving, trying not to let himself get distracted. The park greeted him with a quiet stillness. The faint rustle of leaves underfoot blended with the golden carpet covering the pathways. Andrew wandered deeper in, aiming for a spot far from the scattered joggers and strolling couples. He needed solitude, a chance to shake off the anxious weight pressing against his chest. Finding an empty bench, he sat down, pulling out his laptop. As his favorite melody filled his ears through his headphones, he felt some of the tension begin to dissolve. A light breeze brushed his face, carrying away the weariness clinging to him. Andrew watched the falling leaves, their lazy descent mesmerizing. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of calm. Maybe it's not all that bad, he thought, allowing himself a faint glimmer of hope, but the feeling didn't last long. Just as he exhaled deeply, something yanked the baseball cap off his head with sudden force. He flinched, his eyes darting around. A stray gust of wind? No, it had felt too deliberate. His gaze landed on the cap lying a few feet away on the path. He moved to get up, but a strange unease crawled over him, an almost physical sensation, as though unseen eyes were fixed on him. Andrew scanned the park, but the pathways were empty. The autumn air felt sharper, colder now, biting into his skin. Weird, he muttered, his heartbeat quickening. He lowered himself back onto the bench, but the sense of calm he'd fought to find had vanished. The world around him seemed unnaturally quiet, as though it were holding its breath. Even the music in his headphones, once soothing, now grated on his nerves. Andrew shook his head, pulling the earbuds out. Just then his eyes caught a faint movement in the distance, a shadow standing still by a tree, its form barely distinguishable in the dimming twilight. His breath caught in his throat. "Who's that?" The question whispered through his mind. echoing back louder than he expected. A heavy feeling settled over him, as if some invisible force was slowly pressing down. He wanted to get up, to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The inner voice that had been arguing earlier about the retake and Professor Hunter went silent, replaced by an eerie void that made his chest tighten. The autumn park exhaled a deceptive stillness. Leaves, pushed gently by the wind, blanketed the paths in a golden russet quilt. The air was dense and cool, carrying a faint dampness. Andrew sat on a bench, one leg crossed over the other, inhaling the crisp, bittersweet scent of fall. Soft, barely audible music played through his earbuds, slowing time to a crawl. The melody painted faint, fleeting images in his mind. The warmth of childhood, quiet laughter, the aroma of homemade pie on weekends. It seemed to strip away the tension built up over countless hours of studying, easing the pounding in his head. A thick haze, half dreamlike, began to cloud his thoughts, pulling him toward an almost meditative state. But the fragile peace shattered without warning. A snap. Andrew felt his baseball cap pulled clean off his head, as though yanked by an invisible hand. Instinctively, he flinched, dislodging his earbuds, and his laptop teetered precariously on his knees. "Damn it," he muttered, scanning the area. His eyes settled on the cap lying on the path, bathed in the faint, shifting light of the setting sun. Something about it felt off. The air around him was different, heavier, tinged with an unspoken unease. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in his chest, a primal warning. Andrew slowly looked up. The space before him shimmered, like heat rising from asphalt on a scorching day. From this distorted ripple, a figure emerged. A long black cloak clung tightly to its impossibly lean form. The figure was tall, its limbs stretched beyond normal proportions. But what struck Andrew most were the eyes, or rather, the absence of them. Hollow sockets stared back, pulling him into their void, draining warmth from his body and replacing it with an icy dread. Andrew froze. His mind, scrambling for an explanation, found none. Who are you?" he whispered. The figure stepped closer. Andrew's gaze dropped to its hands, bony and skeletal, clutching the polished wooden handle of a scythe. The blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, a sickly sharp curve that promised finality. "Come," it said, its voice low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. Andrew recoiled instinctively, a surge of adrenaline jolting him upright. He stumbled back, his foot catching the edge of the bench, sending him sprawling to the ground. His hands clawed at the damp earth, leaves clinging to his palms as he tried desperately to push himself up. "Get up. Move," his mind screamed, but his body betrayed him. His legs felt sluggish, heavy, as though rooted to the spot. The metallic tang of fear filled his mouth as he struggled to breathe. His trembling hands dug into the muddy path, nails breaking as he fought for traction. He was slipping, physically and mentally, into a vortex of terror. "Run," he told himself. "You have to run." But before he could act, he saw it. The edge of the black cloak swayed mere inches from his face. Lifting his head with great effort, Andrew found himself staring up at the figure. "You must come with me," it said. Its voice was no longer thunderous, but quieter now, a chilling whisper that crawled under his skin. The words held an inescapable weight, as if they carried an ancient, unyielding truth. Andrew's breath hitched, his pulse pounding in his ears. The world around him blurred, the vibrant autumn colors fading into a suffocating gray. Even the wind seemed to falter, the leaves hanging motionless in the still air. "Why?" he managed to croak, his voice cracking with fear. The figure paused as if considering its answer. Then its tone softened, unexpectedly gentle. "You have many unfinished tasks." Andrew's brows furrowed in confusion. "I give you one chance," it continued. "You may finish one of them. Only one." The words hit him like a jolt. His thoughts, chaotic and fragmented, began to race. He saw flashes of neglected obligations, unspoken words, unresolved regrets, a swirling montage of the life he had yet to fully live. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice trembling with desperation. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended a bony finger pointing back toward the bench. Andrew blinked, and in that instant, the scene shifted. He was standing on the path, looking at himself. There he was, slumped on the bench, his head tipped back against the wooden slats, the baseball cap discarded nearby. His laptop rested precariously on his knees, as still as the lifeless air around him. This wasn't a vision. It was real. Andrew glanced around as the park came back to life. Distant birdsong broke the silence, a light breeze returned, and the vibrant hues of autumn flooded back into view. Yet something within him had changed irrevocably. The figure, the embodiment of death, was gone. But its words lingered, carved into his mind. You must choose what to finish. Time is short. Andrew came to on the same bench where, just moments, or maybe hours ago, he'd been drowning in despair. Suddenly the weight of reality hit him again, and he shot to his feet. His baseball cap lay on the path, his laptop carelessly discarded beside it. In that moment, everything felt strangely familiar. Yet at the same time, foreign. He grabbed his things without looking back and hurried off, barely aware of what was happening. His steps were quick, almost running, as his mind raced from one thought to another. What am I supposed to finish? What unfinished business do I have? The questions kept swirling in his head, unanswered. The exam? A project? The motorcycle crash that had changed his life forever? That night he lost everything? He struggled to find the right answer, but everything slipped through his fingers like fog. But then, almost against his will, one name surfaced in his mind. Kaylee. It was tied to everything. His first love, his first true loss. Haley, the one he'd been ready to share everything with. Their dreams, their ambitions, their nights spent talking, their future plans. But it all shattered that night, when their bike couldn't handle the turn and threw them both onto the asphalt. Andrew survived, but Haley, she was gone. It happened 2 years ago, but the wound in his soul hadn't healed. Every day, every hour, every moment seemed to leave a mark on his heart. He never could bring himself to visit her grave. He couldn't forgive himself for surviving when she hadn't. He had always blamed himself for her death, never fully understanding how it happened. But now, in this strange, foggy state, brought on by the encounter with the figure in the black cloak, he understood one thing. Haley was a part of his unfinished story. And maybe, just maybe, it was her soul he needed to let go of in order to move forward. Andrew walked quickly down the familiar streets, not noticing how tightly his fingers gripped the laptop. He moved, lost in memories, trying to reclaim at least a piece of the world that had slipped away with her. And then he stopped in front of the old house, the very one where he and Haley had laughed together, drank coffee in the kitchen, talked about the future, not noticing how it was slipping away, leaving them in this cozy corner full of light. It had once been their home, but now it felt like a stranger's. Looking at the windows that had once been her eyes, he felt the weight of remembering everything. He didn't want to. He was afraid to face what could break him, consume him completely. But it seemed there was no other way. He didn't ring the bell. Instead, he fumbled in his pocket for the old set of keys, heading to the entrance. The keys were worn, dull, with frayed edges, but they fit perfectly. The door creaked open, as if welcoming him after a long silence. He climbed to the 6th floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Silence reigned. It felt like the building had been abandoned, like his life was stuck in these walls, in these memories. But when he reached her door, everything around him seemed to freeze. He slowly reached for the doorknob. In that moment, it felt like his heart stopped. It was as if something was missing. His hand trembled, and he couldn't bring himself to open the door. What would her mother say? How could he look her in the eye, knowing he hadn't come in time when it was so important? He didn't know what to say. But then, the door swung open. Standing before him was a woman. She was old, her face lined with wrinkles, but her eyes, though tired, were full of life. He saw her, and everything else faded away. This was one of those moments when time seemed to slow down. He stood there, unsure of what to say, while she silently looked at him, as if her heart already knew why he was there. Andrew couldn't utter a word. He simply stood there, leaning against the door, trying to comprehend that this couldn't be real. He thought she had been dead, that it was all over. But now what? How was he supposed to handle what he was seeing? Meanwhile, her words sank into his consciousness, and he struggled to force himself to understand their meaning. They spoke of forgiveness, of letting go. But how could he do that, when everything around him reminded him of the loss, and in every corner, memories of what had been lost forever lingered? Andrew stood there, frozen, like he was paralyzed. His heart pounded so loudly, it felt like it could be heard in the silence. His breath came in gasps, and everything in front of him blurred. He couldn't believe what he was seeing was real. Haley. Alive. But not like she remembered her. She sat in a wheelchair, her body frail, her face radiating a pain he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He waited for everything to disappear, for it to be just a dream. He even closed his eyes for a second, hoping that when he opened them she'd be gone and the world where she was dead would return. But when he opened them again, she was still there, staring at him with a slight surprise in her eyes. Andrew? Her voice was soft and calm, like she couldn't believe she was seeing him. She said his name, and those two words, his most treasured, cut through the silence. Tears flooded his eyes, and he couldn't hold them back anymore. He took a few steps forward and knelt in front of her. His fingers brushed over her knees, over her skin, like he was trying to make sure it wasn't a dream. He lost his voice, just resting his head on her lap, as if seeking something in her presence to bring him even a sliver of peace. He knew it couldn't be real. He knew she was dead, that this was a cruel mirage created by his broken mind. But she was here, and her presence burned him from the inside, searing his soul. Haley, on the other hand, didn't move. She just wiped the tears that were rolling down her cheeks. She looked at him silently, her eyes full of pain and longing. But there was more than that. There was understanding. An understanding that this moment was long awaited, but at the same time, terribly complicated. It was a test for her, too. She didn't know how to react, how to see him, after so much time had passed. I thought you were dead. Her voice trembled, filled with doubt and an unspeakable hurt. She sighed quietly and then added, I tried so many times to find you. I was afraid you didn't survive that night. Her words broke off as she raised a hand to touch his hair. But her hands stopped in midair, not reaching his head. I never thought I'd see you again. Andrew didn't know how to respond. He was lost in the moment. No matter how hard he tried, the words wouldn't come. He just sat there, on the floor, with his head on her lap, feeling her soft fingers touch his hair. They were so close, yet so far apart. Their world had been shattered, and now they were trying to piece it back together. But all they could do was cry. Cry for what was lost and what was now right in front of them. You're alive. You're alive. Andrew whispered these words like a prayer, not believing them. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and he saw the same pain in her gaze that he felt in his own. He saw in her face the reflection of his own suffering, his own torment that he'd carried inside him all these years. I couldn't come to your grave, he whispered, his voice full of regret and deep sorrow. I couldn't bear it. I thought you were dead. I thought I was alone. Haley sighed softly, her hand resting on his head again. You weren't alone, Andrew. You were always in my heart. I knew you were alive, I knew you were somewhere, but I couldn't find you. Words couldn't capture the storm of emotions they were both feeling. This wasn't just a reunion. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a collision of two souls that were bound by something greater than life and death. It was forgiveness, acceptance, but also loss, because they could never go back to the world that once was, when everything was simpler and clearer. I don't know what to do, he whispered, like maybe saying it out loud could ease his inner pain. I don't know how to fix what's been broken. Haley smiled through her tears, her eyes lighting up, though she was so fragile. You don't have to fix anything, Andrew. You just have to be here. Just be with me. That's enough. He stood and sat next to her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. She was so weak, so fragile in her suffering, but she was here. And he was here, in this moment, and nothing else mattered. Everything else faded away. With every breath, every look, every word, they started to rebuild the connection that was once broken. And though time passed, and though they couldn't get the past back, in this present moment, they found something important: forgiveness, love, and comfort. Andrew pressed his shoulder to hers, feeling her breath even out, and the world around them seemed a little less frightening. In that silence, surrounded by tears, they felt that maybe, just maybe, not everything was lost. Andrew stood beside Haley, his hands moving carefully as he helped her lay out the groceries on the kitchen table. But inside, all he felt was one thing: unease. The desperate pain that had tortured him in the days after the accident was gone. But now there was something else. A nagging understanding that his soul still wasn't at peace. He didn't know what exactly he was supposed to do, but his inner voice kept shouting that something was left unfinished. And maybe that something had to do with Haley. Her life was so different now. With every word she spoke, every glance she sent his way, he felt pain, but also incredible resilience. Haley was a woman who had faced death and come back, but not entirely. She was here, but she wasn't the same person she had been before the accident. Her face was still the same, her eyes still held that spark in life, but her body was paralyzed. She could no longer run through parks or jump on motorcycles the way they used to. Every day was a struggle, but she kept fighting. "I don't want you to pity me," Haley said when Andrew finally snapped out of his thoughts and looked at her. She placed her hand on his, and it felt so natural, as though they had always been this close, as if there hadn't been that long silence between them, that emptiness that had separated them 2 years ago. Andrew felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say something comforting, something encouraging, but the words wouldn't come. He knew that nothing could bring things back. He knew he couldn't bring back the life they had lost, couldn't bring back the person who was lost in that terrible night. He didn't know how to move forward, how to deal with everything he had been through. He didn't know how to become the person who could give Haley what she needed. Not pity, but support, not sympathy, but strength. "I tried to find the strength to keep living," Haley continued quietly, her voice soft as though she was still trying to understand what she was feeling now. "But it's hard, you know? It's hard when you're left alone with yourself and with what happened." Andrew stayed silent. He couldn't find the right words. All he wanted was to be there with her, to help her, to bring back even just a little bit of the light that had once been in her life. But he didn't know how. How could he bring back her joy when he himself had lost it somewhere along the way? Suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from her mother's room, a short, sharp chime. Haley flinched. Her face went pale, but she quickly composed herself. She reached for her wheelchair, and Andrew hurried to help her. Their steps became coordinated, familiar, even though it was so hard for Haley to move. But she didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. She just did what she could. When they entered her mother's room, the atmosphere shifted. It was quiet, as still as the deepest part of the night. Death stood at the foot of the sick woman's bed. She was wearing the same black cloak, the scythe in her hand. But her eyes were different now. No longer empty, no longer the abyss that had met Andrew in the park. Now in her eyes there was light, warm and peaceful. The kind of light that seemed to say she hadn't come to take, but to set things free. Andrew froze. He didn't know what to think. Death didn't seem as terrifying to him as it had before. Her presence felt almost soothing, like she wasn't here to take life away, but to let it finish what it had started. "We made a deal," Death said in a soft, almost sympathetic voice, and her gaze slid back to Andrew. There was no threat in her words, only something like understanding. As if she knew what had been done, and that now it was time for new steps. "My task is done," she continued, and there was something quiet and final in her words, as if she wasn't just talking about her mission, but about everything she had done for them, for each of them. "Now it's your turn. Don't forget, there's still a lot of unfinished business."